In the tense years after World War II, when jet bombers crossed oceans and mushroom clouds remapped fear, the Soviet Union made a fateful decision that would remain hidden for decades behind euphemism, compartmentalization, and the brisk confidence of scientific authority. It built a vast, parallel world of laboratories and factories dedicated not to vaccines or public health, but to the weaponization of disease. The enterprise wore a harmless name, Biopreparat, biological preparation, and an even more harmless disguise, a civilian biotechnology agency tasked with producing antibiotics, vaccines, and agricultural remedies. Behind closed doors, it became an empire of secrecy stretching from Moscow to Kazakhstan to the Aral Sea, a network that trained thousands of specialists and diverted the language of medicine into the grammar of war. Inside that network, researchers explored the hardest, darkest questions modern biology could pose: which pathogens spread silently and which terrify, which survive the heat of flight and which shatter in sunlight, how to keep a virus potent through storage and transport, how to scale a petri dish into a production line, how to present a face of benign science to the world while pursuing the opposite. This is the story of Biopreparat, the secret bioweapons complex of the Soviet Union, told not as a list of formulas or a manual for misuse, but as a human drama about ambition, fear, deception, and the long fallout when knowledge is shackled to power. It begins, paradoxically, with hope. After 1945, biology seemed poised to heal a broken world. Antibiotics were taming infections that had killed armies. Vaccines were wiping out scourges that haunted childhood. Geneticists were sketching the architecture of life. Epidemiologists were showing how sanitation could do what heroics never could. Yet war had its own gravitational pull. States remembered how epidemics had crippled armies and how rumors of invisible plagues could empty cities faster than shells. In Washington and London, remnants of wartime programs were archived or dismantled. In Moscow, where invasion had burned itself into memory, leaders looked at biology and saw not only cures but leverage. Soviet scientists had suffered under Lysenkoism in the 1930s and 40s, a disastrous detour that punished genetics and starved crops. By the 1950s, a more pragmatic view returned, and with it came new funding for microbiology, officially for health and agriculture, unofficially for everything else. Military institutes had existed since the 1920s to guard borders against epidemics, part of the so-called anti-plague system. They studied cholera, plague, tularemia, anthrax, brucellosis. They trained doctors to stamp outbreaks in the southern republics and along trade routes. That infrastructure was a perfect shell for ambition. You could build field labs, train responders, and stockpile supplies, and if anyone asked, you could point to a map of natural foci and nod gravely about public safety. A new layer was added. Civilian ministries set up innocuous research plants and pharmaceutical lines. On paper, they produce interferon, antibiotics, veterinary vaccines, insecticides. Behind the fence, they quietly selected strains, perfected stabilizers, learned how to dry and mill and fill. At the top sat Biopreparat, created in the late 1970s as an umbrella for dozens of institutes and plants and positioned carefully outside the Ministry of Defense. The separation wasn't accidental. It offered plausible deniability and a more attractive face to foreign visitors. It also created a competitive engine. Military labs asked questions about delivery and doctrine. Biopreparat promised they could supply the agent. Together they formed a pipeline from bench to bunker. The 1972 Biological Weapons Convention should have closed that pipeline. The treaty outlawed development and stockpiling of biological agents of types and in quantities that had no justification for peaceful purposes. The Soviet Union signed with a straight face and a pen that had already written budget lines to do the opposite. In public, it endorsed the ideal of a world where biology served only life. In practice, it accelerated the secret program and told managers to invent a cover that would withstand questions. The cover was elegant, a crash effort to master cutting-edge biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, build synthetic insulin, expand vaccine output, modernize fermentation. Biopreparat could recruit the best graduates with the promise of modern labs and patriotic purpose. It could hold conferences, publish certain papers, invite foreign delegations to tour a wing with spotless centrifuges. Meanwhile, down corridors that visitors never walked, Pathogens were cataloged not by how they could be defeated, but by how they could be dispersed. The menu reflected a grim calculus. Anthrax appealed to planners because spores endure and factories understand powder. Tularemia had a reputation among soldiers from earlier wars for causing long fevers and operational collapse. Brucellosis incapacitated without the spectacle of hemorrhage. Glanders, once a disease of horses, could disable logistics. Plague was studied with a mix of awe and dread, a medieval terror given modern tools. And hovering above them all was smallpox, officially a disease on the brink of eradication thanks to a global campaign, unofficially a candidate for resurrection as a strategic equalizer because vaccination in many countries had faded and the virus terrified in a way few others could. Names attached themselves to places and the map turned into a code. In Koltsovo near Novosibirsk, a gleaming institute rose that would later be known as Vector, presented to the world as a crown jewel of virology while serving as a repository for dangerous strains and a research center on how to grow them fast and keep them lethal. In Stepnogorsk, on the Kazakh steppe, an industrial complex learned to scale the production of certain bacteria in fermentation tanks, measured not in liters, but in tons. On Vozrostenia Island in the Aral Sea, where water retreated and left salt flats shining, field tests occurred with animals as proxies and instruments recording how air and sun and wind played with aerosols. Elsewhere, institutes mapped the genetics of microbes not to cure them, but to harden them against heat and sunlight and disinfectant, or to select variants that produced more toxin per cell. Publicly, these were centers for prophylaxis, vaccine plants, veterinary institutes. Privately, there were chapters in a national manual on how to turn life against life. The secrecy was meticulous. Workers signed layers of non-disclosure. Rooms were separated not only by locks but by paper trails. Procurement went through front companies. Reports moved in coded summaries. Even within the complex, a microbiologist in one city might know little about what an engineer was scaling in another. People believed what they needed to believe, that their work was defensive, that it was a hedge against American cheating, that it was a temporary necessity until the world grew sane. And yet the world has a way of forcing truth into daylight. In 1971, a research ship in the Aral Sea reported an outbreak that did not follow the normal script. A small party returned to shore. Several fell ill with a rash that doctors recognized with disbelief. Smallpox, a disease on the verge of being beaten globally, appearing here in a region with testing grounds in classified zones. The outbreak was contained through vaccination and quarantine, and the incident disappeared into a file. 8 years later, in the industrial city then called Sverdlovsk, sirens and rumors chased each other through neighborhoods as men began to die after a strange, violent illness that started with fever and ended with lungs flooded and blackened. The official story blamed tainted meat. Families were pressed to sign papers, death certificates listed vague causes, and the city moved on. But patterns whispered otherwise. The victims had lived downwind of a military compound and worked in places that kept them outdoors. Their disease looked like inhalational anthrax, the form associated not with food, but with air. The truth surfaced only after the Soviet Union fell apart, and survivors spoke, and scientists pieced meteorology to pathology. A filter change, a lapse in a protocol, perhaps only minutes of exposure at a vent, and spores no larger than dust had stitched a trail through a working-class district, killing dozens and leaving a curve on a map that mirrored the wind. These accidents were not definitive proof of intent, Defender said, only reminders of how dangerous biology could be. But inside the system, managers responded the way managers do when a dangerous system reveals its weakness. They tightened rules in one place and pushed production harder in another, and the logic of the enterprise rolled forward. To understand how such a system worked from the inside, you need more than documents. You need a witness. In the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union dissolved and budgets vanished, a senior manager from the complex sought a new life and carried a story with him. He described how the structure was built to bypass treaty obligations, how civilian titles masked military ends, how careers rewarded the boldest growth targets and the neatest reports. He described projects aimed at making familiar pathogens more robust, not exotic science fiction, but incremental engineering, choosing strains for resilience, adjusting growth media, testing stabilizers that kept particles viable after storage or dispersal. He spoke of the pride many felt in their technical achievements and of the moral unease that settled only when loyalties shifted and the program seemed less inevitable than it once had. For the outside world, his account confirmed a suspicion that a paper treaty had been treated as a linguistic puzzle to be solved, not a promise to be kept. Governments reacted with a mixture of alarm and opportunity. Inspectors were proposed, joint projects were floated, former weapons scientists were offered grants to redirect their skills toward public health and diagnostics. Visits were arranged to some facilities, carefully scripted, where visitors saw modern labs and animal rooms and were told that any previous military work had stopped immediately after the treaty, or at least immediately after the leadership had realized the moral stakes. The truth, as usual, was messier. Some lines had stopped, some continued in narrower form, some were transformed into biodefense, a word that can describe noble work and also hide continuity. One reason the story still chills is that it shows how easily good science can be bent by state purpose. None of the techniques that made the complex dangerous were inventions so exotic that they belonged to legend. They were refinements of ordinary industrial microbiology learned in breweries and vaccine plants, scaled and disciplined and joined to military thinking about delivery and effect. Inside that frame, questions about human factors mattered as much as questions about petri dishes. How do you train technicians to make no mistakes, ever, with materials that forgive nothing? How do you motivate them when secrecy forbids open publication and pride? How do you constrain curiosity so that a bright mind does not wander toward improvisation? The answers were familiar: higher pay, better apartments, dachas, medals, privileges, and the flattery of phrases like strategic significance. And always the warning that foreign enemies surely cheated too, so patriotism demanded symmetry. The deeper you look, the more the narrative becomes a study in self-justification. Engineers told themselves they were solving puzzles, not planting seeds. Administrators told themselves they were preventing strategic surprise, not inviting it. Party officials told themselves that history excused hard choices. And then history ended for the country that had made those choices. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the complex found itself with half-paid guards at gates, unpaid scientists with enviable resumes, and stockpiles that no budget line now maintained. International programs scrambled to address the most urgent risks, to secure stores, to employ expertise in peaceful labs, to fence and mark test ranges where burial pits lay shallow under salt crusts and wind. Meanwhile, a world that had believed biological weapons belonged to the theater of Cold War superpowers discovered how fast biology was accelerating on its own. DNA sequencing became routine. PCR machines sat on lab benches from Boston to Bangalore, and the line between defensive and dual-use research blurred with every new paper on pathogenesis. Biopreparat's legacy thus arrived not only as a cautionary tale from the past, but as a mirror for the future. What do you do with knowledge that can heal or harm in the same afternoon depending on intention and context? How do you design treaties that monitor intent, not just equipment? How do you build a culture in laboratories that resists the seduction of strategic prestige? For historians, cataloging the complex offers stark episodes. There is the portrait of a gleaming virology institute, where researchers, brilliant and ambitious, sequence and freeze and plan under the emblem of progress, while a second set of keys unlocks rooms with different logbooks. There is the production plant on the steppe with its long corridors, its stainless tanks humming, its quality control room where technicians check particle sizes and viability curves, because the order sheet demands consistency like any factory's. There is the island in a shrinking inland sea where swarms of insects rise at dusk, and where field teams set out grids and release devices, and then record how long it takes disease to carve across a slope of scrub under a dry wind. There are the hospitals downwind and downsea that treat pneumonia of unknown origin, fever of unknown origin, and are told to recover and move on. There are quiet small tragedies as well, a researcher with a needlestick who returns to work too soon, a technician who memorizes safety mantras and still breaks a vial in a cabinet, a family that reads a death notice that speaks only in abstractions. For ethicists, the questions are older. Can secrecy ever domesticate biology, or does secrecy turn risk into fate by shutting out the criticism that keeps science honest? What does consent mean for a population that is never told what is studied in its name? How should the world treat whistleblowers who helped build a machine before they decided to expose it? What does justice look like when a state's long project breaks the rules and then the state itself disappears into new flags and leaders? For citizens, the story tends to harden into a simpler lesson. If a government can justify it, it will eventually try it. Oversight must be vigilant, treaties must be enforced, and transparency is not a luxury, but a safety mechanism. For scientists working today, the lesson is more intimate. Choose work that you could explain to your neighbors without euphemism. Choose mentors who prefer sunlight to legend. Build cultures that reward those who raise uncomfortable questions early. And remember that the line between defense and offense is not only technical, it is moral. It is the set of decisions you make when nobody applauds, and when the budget is tight, and when an easy shortcut beckons. There is a coda to the story that lives not in archives but in the world outside laboratory doors. The eradication of smallpox, the signature triumph of global health, stands as the counter-narrative to every impulse that built Biopreparat. It showed what happens when nations share samples, protocols, and credit, when the currency of prestige becomes lives saved, when surveillance is used to chase a virus, not a rival. The same tools that a weapons complex used to scale disease, cold chains, logistics, train cadres, are the tools that wipe disease out. The difference lies in purpose, and purpose is a choice renewed every budget cycle and every generation. When former facilities in the post-Soviet space were redirected to public health, when researchers trained for war began to sequence outbreaks for ministries of health, a small kind of redemption became possible. They applied their discipline to cholera on rivers, to influenza in markets, to brucellosis on farms. They learned to publish and to argue in journals instead of whispering in corridors. It did not erase the past. Nothing can. But it modeled a future where the granaries of knowledge are guarded not by fences, but by norms. In telling this story, we refuse two temptations. We refuse the temptation of technical detail that pretends to be education while it is really instruction, that belongs in a history of ideas, but not in the world of easy replication and uneven guardrails. And we refuse the temptation of myth that says such a program could only exist in one nation or one era. Biopreparat was Soviet in its bureaucracy and secrecy, but the ingredients, fear, rivalry, pride, the thrill of mastery, are human. They can be arranged anywhere if we let them. Imagine one last scene. A young microbiologist walks into a facility in the late Soviet years. The entrance hall is bright, the posters speak of vaccines and productivity, the mission statement praises health. She signs a document she barely reads because everyone signs it. In her lab, she learns to culture cells, to calibrate instruments, to keep notebooks precisely. She is promoted for meeting targets she cannot describe to her family. She is told that history demands sacrifices, that the West is plotting, that science must serve the motherland. Years later, the country dissolves, the fences rust. Foreigners arrive with grants and questions. She decides to stay, to retrain, to work openly. She teaches students to keep two commitments at once, to curiosity and to conscience. When they ask about the old days, she describes rooms and smells and schedules, but avoids certain words because she has learned how easily words can do harm. That restraint is not silence. It is a vow that science will not be drafted again so easily. Biopreparat's existence proved that biology can be twisted into a weapon at industrial scale, even under treaties and even under banners of peace. Its collapse showed how fragile such empires are once secrecy weakens and once scientists choose transparency over myth. The world remains full of dangers, natural and imagined, but we hold in our hands the means to shape which dangers grow. If there is a final lesson here, it is that the defense of humanity begins long before borders and brigades, with habits in laboratories, with norms in classrooms, with skepticism toward expedient stories, and with the unglamorous work of building trust. Tell the truth about what you study. Share it with those who can check you. Keep your doors open enough that fewer ghosts grow in the shadows. And remember that the most powerful preparation any society can make is not a hidden arsenal, but a public covenant that knowledge will be used to save and not to sow.